It's been a very strong start for Labour as results from the local council elections continue to come in, and they've won control of a string of key Leave voting councils in England and Wales. And Labour took Rushmore Council in a key breakthrough in the home of the British Army for the first time, a council the Tories had run for the past 24 years. Well, joining us now is former British Army officer Major General Tim Cross. Tim, a delight to have you on the show. It seems inconceivable to many. I've been speaking to veterans this morning. They cannot get their heads around the fact that Rushmore, Aldershot, the home of the British Armed Forces, the totemic area, has for the first time fallen to the Labour Party. Does this tell us that Sir Keir Starmer's message is right, that Labour can be trusted on defence, or is it something else? Is it Conservative voters utterly frustrated at the treatment of the armed forces by the Conservative government?
Well, I suspect it's a mixture of all of those things and others too. The local MP here is Leo Doherty, who's an ex-army man, came in fairly recently. So, you know, there's a lot of traditional military stuff around here, but it's worth saying that the military is not political in one sense. It's not, you know, unified politically. People have their own views, as they do in any other sphere of life. Traditionally, you sort of hinted at it, really, Conservatives have had a reputation for being stronger on defence. But to be honest, you know, I go back a long time in defence. I go back to the 1960s and Labour governments over the years, if I would say, but from my personal perspective, we've done very well under Labour governments in the past. I can think back to all sorts of defence secretaries who did a very good job for us, and many of whom, I have to say, took part in World War II and in various theatres of operation in World War II, particularly in those early years up to the 1970s and so on. So I think, you know, the change we're seeing is a reflection of a change across the country. We've had a government for 13 years. I suspect, if I'm honest, like myself, I think sometimes you just need a change. And some of the things that have gone on in the last few years, I don't blame the Conservative Party for personally, and I suspect a lot of other people don't do either, but they just feel, you know, it is time for a change. The army has suffered, there's no doubt about that, over the last few years. It's a much smaller army, less capable army than it used to be. I think there is now a recognition that that needs to change, but that recognition is not just within the Conservative Party, it applies to the Labour Party too. So, yeah, I think it's a combination of all of those factors. I'm not that surprised, if I'm honest, but you know, we'll have to wait to see how other things pan out later on in the year.
One thing that was particular to this seat was we just saw some images on the screen there from Farnborough. Rushmore Council oversaw a decision you may well be aware of, 300 luxury flats that were earmarked for asylum seeker families. Now, the locals got very, very strongly enmeshed together. They formed a protest group for many, many weekends, peacefully protested against them. I know for a fact, pals of mine, armed forces veterans, were amongst that group. And there's a feeling, Major General Tim Cross, that their voices were ignored by the council and by their local MP, and the Home Secretary promised to pause this but wouldn't kick it totally out of the seat. And speaking to people who were at the count last night, former Conservative voters, they simply feel that the Conservative Party isn't listening to them. And so while you're correct to say that it's not necessarily a politicisation of the armed forces, in this area, with those values, the people feel they're simply being ignored.
Yeah, there's definitely truth in that. I mean, Farnborough Airfield is a key part of the constituency under Rushmore. There's also been the debate about increasing the number of business flights out of Farnborough Airfield, which has caused quite a lot of local controversy. And I think, generally speaking, that there is a view that for many people, what goes on in Westminster is completely devolved from their day-to-day lives. And when it comes down to these local issues, they do feel sidelined and ignored. I happen to believe, and this may be going against what we've been discussing, but I happen to believe Rushmore Council is a pretty good council. I've lived here since 2006, 2007, and I think they do a pretty good job. Like any other council, they're not perfect by any manner of means. But I do think that you're right. There have been people who've said, in that context, but also in the wider context too of the airfield, that they're not being listened to, and that decisions are taken, and you know, the idea or the promise that they will consult and listen to people is is a message they pass, but is not put into practice in reality.
And Tim, as well as decisions being taken in Westminster that don't reflect the locale, the local mindset, do you think there's something else? Do you think there's a sense of taking the Conservative vote for granted? We've seen in places like North Shropshire, in areas that would never dream of swinging any other way than True Blue. Aldershot, Rushmore falls into that camp, does it not? 24 straight years, never being Labour. Is it a case of, do you think, local politicians, local councils saying, well, they always vote Conservative, so why do we need to bother? But the interesting thing about the data is that while the Labour Party vote has more or less remained the same, there's been a gradual erosion of the Conservative vote. They don't feel listened to, so they're staying away. Apathy appears to be the enemy.
Yeah, well, certainly when I went to vote yesterday at my local polling station, I went in about, 10 o'clock, 10:30, and it had been a very quiet morning. I don't know what the turnout has been, actually, both in this area but elsewhere.
About 27%.
Yeah, well, you see, which is a sad reflection, really, of, I think, an awful lot of people. I said in the polling station, I don't suppose you're going to have a very busy day today. I think an awful lot of people just stay away. I mean, there's an inevitability reflected in our society that politics is a pain and politicians are a pain. They don't listen to us, etc. I happen to take this whole business extremely seriously. I spent 43 years of my life defending democracy and the rule of law and so forth. And we collectively need to be very careful about not being complacent about democracy in the same way as politicians need to be very careful about not being complacent about our votes and our attitudes. I think within the wider society, there is this division which has opened up over the last few years. And I do think there's an issue where we need to think carefully about what democracy means for us today, what it means in the current situation, world situation, etc. And politicians need to work hard at making sure people do get engaged. And in one sense, that's not new. I can remember that sort of conversation going on, back in the 70s and so on. But there is, I think there is a sense of complacency both within the electorate, but also within the politicians themselves.
And as well as defending democracy for all those years, you're a mobiliser of men and women. You get people up the ladder, metaphorically. If it were down to you, how do we re-engage people who are simply giving up? They're uncoupling from the democratic process. They don't think they're being listened to. They're staying away. They're staying at home. And that is a travesty, Major General Tim Cross. How do we get those people in places like Rushmore, in places like Aldershot, in particular the Conservative Party? How do they say to such communities which are a linchpin of the armed forces, you should vote for us? What do they need to do?
Well, how long we got? We could be here for a long time, couldn't we? Look, I think this is a broader issue about leadership. I left the army in 2007, and I run a portfolio which is a mixture of business and academia, charity, humanitarian work, and so forth. I happen to be a lay minister in the church too. My strapline, if you like, is morally courageous leadership. We need MPs to be morally and courageous, and they need to inspire and lead people. And I just think we're living in a world at the moment where a lot of people have lost trust in institutions. We could see that in a number of different places, from the post office, frankly, to the BBC and to other media outlets, and to the whole role of social media, etc., which is undermining, authority and so on. So people have lost trust in that, and it will only be reborn if people genuinely believe that they are. I mean, in the military, I was taught my hat badge at Sandhurst is serve to lead. It's a great biblical principle, actually. Christ was the greatest servant leader of them all. And we don't sense that many of our politicians really believe that. And they need to work hard at inspiring us and getting us back to recognize that they are there to serve us. They are there to listen to us. And we collectively need to think through again this idea of, what do we stand for? One of the issues for us today, I think, is what do we stand for in Western civilization, actually, in a broader context? What do we stand for? Remembering that over half the world, people around the world are living under the brutal dictatorships and non-democratic regimes, the enthrall of dictatorships and so on. More than half the world are living under that. And if we don't begin to understand what we stand for and why democracy is so important, we will lose the plot. And there is no God-given right for Western civilization to survive as it is. I mean, if we were having this conversation in Babylon, which I happened to have visited back in 2003, we would have believed the Babylonian Empire would last forever. Well, it didn't. Neither the Roman Empire or the Greek Empire or indeed the British Empire. So, Western civilization doesn't have a God-given right to survive. We have to make sure that it will survive by engaging in these conversations and by understanding the importance of democracy and the liberal capitalism and so on.